Hey, Geekscapists, welcome to a brand new Geekscape podcast. I'm Jonathan London, your host. If this is your first Geekscape, strap yourselves in for some pop culture talk. We usually talk movies, video games, comic books, TV, all of that pop culture goodness that you can fit in your noggin over the course of the next, hour or so conversation. I like to sit down with storytellers as a storyteller myself and talk to them about why they tell stories, what their obsession is, and really how that stuff comes to fruition. Had a wonderful weekend last time, and maybe you heard it here on the Geekscape feed if you're a subscriber. Last weekend, LA Comic Con, that was fantastic. I got to bring my baby for the first time to a comic convention, and that was stressful. But you heard about it on the panel where she sat in silence with my wife as we did a Geekscape live in front of an audience. And what a wonderful episode. It was so much fun. I love doing live Geekscapes at conventions. It's just good to meet new people. And as you heard, we had Dimitri from the Keeg joined us on that panel along with Rod Kim. And I can't wait to collaborate with those people again. You also heard some Geekscape mainstays, right? You heard the folks from Superhero Stuff You Should Know. You heard Josh from Dynamic Resolution, our video game show. Those are available here on the Geekscape network. But you know, that's what we do that stuff for, is to meet people, let them know what Geekscape's about, do a live Geekscape, and share some of that fun. Before that, in the feed, if you're into kaiju versus giant robots, some of my favorite stuff, we have a really good episode from a panel at LA Comic Con the night before. The audio got a way, it's tough. I don't have anybody monitoring the audio when we record these things. So sometimes the mics are at different levels. I can only test it so much because I'm testing during the panel before me, and maybe maybe there's just nobody at that microphone, and I can't really be like, hey, can you slide over mid panel and test that microphone to your left? So it's quick, and also sometimes panelists who are sharing a mic are in each other's spaces, and so somebody's voice is a little lower than the other person because of not wanting to go cheek to cheek with them to record. So it's a great panel. Tons of information from people like Chris Black, who runs the Monarch show, the Godzilla show on Apple, Gavin Hignight and FJ DeSanto, who worked on Transformers War for Cybertron with Brandon Eason, who's also on there. Gavin's Gundam show hits Netflix this Thursday, so look forward to that. And then, of course, Chris Buccellato, who you guys have heard of a lot on Geekscape, is the comic book creator, and he did that JLA versus Godzilla versus Kong comic. So he, of course, was on the panel. What a bunch of heavy hitters. So it's right there in the feed. Subscribe, share it with your friends. And again, apologies for that audio. Sometimes when I'm live at these things and don't have somebody like Matt Kelly, who runs the network, happy birthday, Matt, it's hard to get really smooth audio. But we're back home today. We've got some amazing stuff for you. My friend Aaron Carnes is here. He is the author of In Defense of Ska. He is also a journalist. He's been a music journalist for a while and loves ska. Does not like you guys who are ridiculing the ska. And he started a podcast about it called In Defense of Ska, and put out a book in 2021. And now he is releasing this month. You can pre-order it. The second edition. You know what? It's not a second. It's an expanded edition of In Defense of Ska. It's got so many new goodies in it. You're going to want to get your hands on that because I know I'm going to read it. My good friend George Pepe in Texas says, George Pepe is here. Ska is the best. And I agree with you. Recently I was on the podcast This Band Sucks about Real Big Fish, and we were covering the song Don't Start a Band. It was amazing being on that podcast and just talking about directing that video. I can't believe it's been 19 years, and I love my Real Big Fish family. I love all my ska families from all those bands. And when Aaron emailed me to come on the show, absolutely. It's been a little hectic with the baby and, Comic-Con and all that stuff had to wait. But here we are. His book comes out in like 2 weeks, and he's coming to Los Angeles. I want to meet him in person. He's coming to Los Angeles early November. We're going to talk about all that stuff. So why don't you guys hang tight? George Pepe corrected me. He said, I'm in Kansas City, dude. What the heck? Yeah, he's in Kansas City. And you know what? I'm going to read your text, George. You texted me and said, let's see, you loved I read the In Defense of Ska. It's a great book. Stoked he will be one of the guests. Well, he's here now. I'm not going to delay. Let's let's kick the theme song. Let's come back here and let's talk to Aaron Carnes about In Defense of Ska and this extended edition he's got coming out on the 29th of the month. Here we go. George Pepe, I'm really sorry about saying that you're in Texas. I had you confused with another friend of mine who is just as enthusiastic as Ska fan. And George, love you, man. Sorry about that. George is a massive Ska fan, and I'm glad you're watching. I also got a text from my good friend Nicholas. You guys know him as Profesor Galactico. I did his video, I think, last year, and he is awesome. Also a ska dude, part of the LA ska scene with the Paranoias, his band. When he's not doing Profesor Galactico, he's in the Paranoias, and they're local. And they're also how I discovered that whole Mexican ska scene here in Los Angeles, the Latino ska scene here in Los Angeles, and bands like Madame Mosca, who were guests on In Defense of Ska. So this guy, this Aaron Carnes, he knows all of them. He's a big Ska fanatic. So let's get him on the show, and let's talk to him about this brand new extended edition of the book. Aaron.
Yes. How you doing?
How has this not happened earlier?
Oh, look at.
I love that shirt. Viva Ska Mexicano. Let's go. I love that. I walked out of the door today with the stereo shirt. The stereo.
Yeah. Stereo is awesome.
Mm-hmm. I love the
not
band.
Not ska, but Ska Roots.
It's Ska Roots and the Impossibles and Animal Chin.
Yes.
And of course, being early Fueled by Ramen bands. So definite Ska Roots. And so as I'm going through this first edition you sent me of In Defense of Ska, I'm just like, dude, you have Mike Park, former Geekscape guest, going through the roster of people who've recently been on In Defense of Ska, a podcast you guys should be subscribing to right now, Ska fans. Of course, you had Megaran, who has a podcast here on the network. You had Ahmed Best and his sister. Ahmed has been on the podcast. Like, it was just like, am I going down the list of Geekscape guests, or is like, what is this?
Have you had MC Lars on the show? Because he's our guest tomorrow.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, I had MC Lars a few times. He was our guest at Comic-Con once or twice as well. Megaran, we're always collaborating with. And then I had Megaran and MC Lars together, I think in 2019, 2020 on Geekscape. So we got to re-up that one. We got to get those guys back.
Megaran, because he did a ska song on his kids' album, I think it was last year. And he said that it was MC Lars who introduced him to and got him enthusiastic about ska.
And of course, those guys, Suburban Legends, worked with MC Lars. I loved doing videos for Suburban Legends, and Geekscape as y'all helped me finish a movie called El Rey. Vince and Brian from Suburban Legends did the music for that one. Scott Klopfenstein does a lot of the music for sometimes my projects. And guys, Aaron's here, and I don't understand how this took so long. We're actually I'm coming to your book event here in Los Angeles. That's on November 4th. Am I
November 4th at Vroman's Books in Pasadena.
Okay.
I have some book events. We can do it now or later. I have some in different parts of the country. I don't know. I assume your guests are. We have guests in Kansas City apparently.
George is here. He said the first edition was an excellent read.
Yeah,
and now
shout out George for that.
Yeah. George, you're amazing. George has been a longtime friend. And then Throttens airs retro gaming and chess. We got a gaming channel over here jumping on the Geekscape thing. And he says, La Ruta, best ska you never heard of. France Geniuses. I can't pronounce this. La Trajectoire de la Home Canon. It's like a French album. This French one record Canadian, was recorded in Quebec. Oh, French Canadian. You heard of these guys?
Actually, I have not. So
Okay,
I will absolutely check them out.
We're gonna make a note of that one. Okay, Throttens airs retro gaming and chess. Thanks for watching. And then Nicholas, have you heard of the Paranoias? These boys from they're awesome. I love them.
The
They have a new
Paranoias are
album
rad.
coming out.
I believe there is a very quick mention of them in my book. Just because
New edition?
as I'm going original edition even. I think I'm just kind of talking about some of the bands in that East LA Latino ska scene you were discussing, and I think I use them as an example because it's a diverse scene,
Yeah.
and some of them are very very traditional ska, some of them are like metal hardcore ska. Paranoias, if I recall, a little bit different than both of those, like a little bit more like pop
Oh,
music,
for sure.
rock. So that's I was using them as an example of like all over the map. Any kind of ska you can imagine, Paranoias are one of those bands, and they're a great band.
It absolutely blew my mind. I went down to see Littlest Man Band in Orange County,
Mhm.
Scott Klopfenstein's band, and they were playing one of those Orange County. I don't know what they're called, but I think one of the local bands in Orange County every year put together like some ska hula baloo, or I don't know. They're always named something like the you know what I'm talking about, the Ska Manifesto hula baloo, and it's in
Yeah.
Garden Grove or something, and the Paranoias opened, and half the songs are in Spanish, and as
Mhm.
someone who's cut right down the middle as a Mexican American, I'm like, wait, huh? What is this? And so I went to see him in East LA, and there was only one half white dude in the entire building, and it was my half that is white. And I was just like, this stuff exists. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And I love those guys, love collaborating with them, and they introduced me to the Matamoscas and all that stuff that is coming out of that scene. And so Aaron, what rock have you not turned over in your time as a journalist covering this? And maybe we start at the beginning. You've been covering music in itself,
Mhm.
specifically punk, for how long now?
Specifically, all genres.
Sure.
I started just doing music journalism in general in like 2009, and I was writing for newspapers and eventually magazines and stuff. So I'm just a music lover myself. I don't like, obviously ska is my favorite form of music, but I love hip hop. I love indie rock. I used to collect like 60s rock records. I love new wave. I really like I love pop music. I totally dig pop music these days. So I don't have like this preference aside from ska in terms of just the music I listen to and the music that I was covering as a journalist. I'm into it all. So whatever like made sense to cover at any given moment is what I would cover. But I think that's part of why I ended up writing a book about ska, was because I felt like here I am. I'm a person. I would gladly read a book about some obscure punk subgenre from like 1978, and I'll read like some critical analysis of some super hipster indie rock band from 2010. I love all of it. Like, why isn't nobody like talking about ska in that way? Like, why is everybody talking about every other genre with that level of like detail and nuance and critical analysis? But when it comes to ska, particularly like everything after two tone, it's just kind of like, bunch of silly kids,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
playing silly music. Like it gets reduced to like this like kind of footnote. And so I just felt like as a journalist and as a music lover, like someone should talk about all this music and talk about it with like sort of the depth that it deserves. So that led to the book, and that led to the podcast. And like the more we do the podcast, and as I've expanded the second edition, it's like you're looking at all these bands and all these scenes, and you're also seeing how much of it's a connected global genre. And I just feel like you talk about what stones have I not turned over. Well, I feel like, like I haven't covered a lot from Europe. I haven't covered a lot from Japan. There are areas where I have knowledge, but I haven't really covered much yet. And I feel like that's coming.
So I still want the Geekscape to get this extended edition because obviously folks like George Pepe like love this first version. Um, but it sounds like you're gonna keep turning over rocks. And correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron, but your actual roots in ska, they go further back though, as a musician.
Yeah.
I mean, you were in bands and stuff like that. Like I'm looking at photos of like Mike Park and the Skink and Pickle folks and all that stuff. And Mike's been on the show. I did his. I always forget this because we shot it in my DP's apartment and we did it real quick and for very cheap with just a doorway dolly. But the Asian Prodigy video is one that I directed for
Oh,
Mike.
you did that?
And
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
the one where he's looking at his home videos or
Yeah.
home. Yeah, that's me. And in Todd Bell who shot it with me, and we're just having Mike. We shot that in about 2 hours just because I love the folks at Hopeless and I love Mike, and there was a window for it before he headed to San Pedro and he was in town, and I said, let's do this. Let's make a video. We can shoot it downstairs. And we had like we lived. I met my DP because I think he was bringing camera equipment into an apartment I used to live in, and we got to talking about filmmaking. And I was like, let me try you out. And it was the Mike Park video, and then Todd Bella turned into, he's great. He's a wonderful DP, but that came out of that.
I got a degree in film actually, and I directed a few videos. I kind of like, I film and TV wasn't for me, but I did a few. I did one for Mike that I wasn't super happy with. I don't even know if it really got released. But I did one. I did one for Dan Potthast solo that I thought.
Oh my god, I love MU330.
It was a delightful, very low budget but delightful video. They're talking out there.
And I love that solo album he did.
Yeah. So if you look up that video, I directed that one, and it's fun. It's a fun video.
You know who got me into Dan Potthast? This is from Austin, back where I grew up. Germ Pollitt.
Yeah, from
Missile Command, and
Missile
before
Command.
that, Gals Panic.
Gals Panic. They're pretty like they don't get enough credit for sort of the role they had in Texas ska.
I agree. And as a kid who discovered ska by going to basement shows, after the Geekscape said you don't care about this, but discovering Dookie, not Dookie, discovering Kerplunk because it was a comic book looking cover of it, and then suddenly being like, oh my god, what is this music? Then going to all the record stores and Lookout Records, and then that leads you to Fat, and that leads you to Maximum Rock and Roll, which you talk about, and then Book Your Own Fucking Life, which you talk about. In Defense of Ska. Book Your Own Fucking Life, Geekscape was a zine, kind of a yearly little newspaper rag book that you could order out of Maximum Rock and Roll, and it had contact information for all the bookers, all the clubs, all the places. Before that, maybe 10, 15 years earlier in the 80s, there's a book you can read called We Built a Scene, and it kind of talks about that whole scene, like the ska one that you were talking about, Aaron, that was built nationwide, from bands from East Coast to San Pedro, kind of connecting as they crisscross the country, sharing notes on who the bookers are, where the venues are, where the kids are, and then booking their own shows. And that's kind of what I was doing in the mid to late 90s in high school, and that's what led me to the Impossibles, Gals Panic, Germ Pollitt, Dan Potthast, Less Than Jake, Real Big Fish. The rest is history. Here we are with Geekscape.
So funny story
incredible.
About Germ. I saw him perform.
Germ Pollitt, yeah.
I saw him perform as a solo artist at Dan Potthast's apartment in Santa Cruz, like some years back. And
recently,
this would have been like 10 years ago.
Tell him hi.
but the thing is, like, Dan Potthast played a solo set, and then Germ played a solo set, like just acoustic guitar in Dan's tiny little Santa Cruz apartment. And there was a song or a line from Germ's set, and I don't know if it's like from one of his old bands or if it's a solo song, but it like stuck with me. He was talking about like, sort of the relationships you have with people you're close to, and the song goes, "We're tight as stitches, we fight like bitches." And
do you not have his solo album?
No,
I can fish it up for you.
Is that a solo album song? Because I just that lyric just stuck with me. I just thought it was such a beautiful, like, poetic line about like what it's like to be close with people.
I think that album came out in 2001. I have it. And along with the Gauss Panic stuff and Missile Command, we are really in the weeds, and it's amazing. if this is your first Geekscape, we do this with movies, video games, comic books, TV. We do this with everybody because every single little thing we obsess about. Like, this is what Geekscape is. We're both a mile wide and a mile deep, I think, because the stuff that people are like, how do you know this stuff? I'm like, I don't know. Geek trivia, throw me in there. But it gives me anxiety. Anyway, trivia gives me anxiety. So that band led to the Impossibles, led to me
Mhm.
discovering that Austin had more of a scene in this and that, and then led to the DIY aesthetic that kind of became Geekscape. But over in the Bay Area where you grew
Mhm.
up, correct?
Yeah. Mhm.
You have a different approach because a lot of those maximum rock and roll people, some of them were in your neighborhood,
Well, see, I
right?
came from a city called Gilroy, which is like kind of the very southern part of the Bay Area, like a little bit removed from like sort of that San Francisco East Bay thing. But as soon as we got cars, we're going to
Yeah.
shows as far as we can. But um, my introduction to ska as a fan was in like '92, seeing Skank and Pickle down in like San Jose area. And then so back to what you were originally saying about my roots going back. Skank, I was already playing music, but I was not playing ska because I wasn't aware of ska. Saw Skank and Pickle in '92, fell in love with the band, fell in love with ska, went deep into the genre, and then almost immediately was like trying to like get my band to shift gears and play ska, which eventually
What were you
happened.
playing?
God, we were into like Police and Rush and like
Okay, not
just like
bad.
well, it's just like not stuff that high school kids
Sure.
do. So we were like weirdo like high school kids playing like very musical stuff.
Yeah.
Um, anyways, so I kind of nudged them to just straight up ska, and
How'd they take to it? You were
they
talking about
did.
Flat Planet is the name of your band?
Yeah. It was Flat
Yeah.
Planet before, and it was Flat Planet then. They took to it well. Our singer, I think he kind of knew he wasn't a right fit for it, and so he
His
kind of
dance
like
moves stunk.
he dipped out, and then our sax player took over as singer.
That's
And
crazy.
it was a better fit. I mean, he's a great guy and he liked the music. He just wasn't a right fit for ska. I
Right.
think, yeah, he
Right.
was aware
I'm
of
not
that.
wearing checkered shoes no matter what. Like, I'm not doing this. Like, what are they? I have to put on suspenders. What is it? And he can do like what's the thing called? The like the
Toasting. Yeah.
toasting. Right, the toasters. He couldn't toast. Do you toast?
No. Do I toast?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't do it. I'm not doing it.
I'm not toasting.
What did you play in the
I'll
band?
just appreciate I was the drummer.
You were the drummer, so you're not you're not going to toast from
Yeah,
back there.
no.
You're not toasting. You'll keep the beat for the toasting, but you're not toasting. And now, when you do the Flat Planet thing,
Yeah.
and now you're like, there's college, post college, you're in your 20s. I'm guessing now as you're approaching the 2000s.
So let's see. I saw Skank and Pickle when I was like 17.
Oh, so you're
And-
definitely in your 20s, and this stuff is like popping onto the radio.
Yeah. So
Were you mad?
I was definitely mad.
Are you serious? Because I have friends that when Out Come the Wolves came out, were so pissed
Yeah.
that Rancid had put ska back on an album. Right now, Come the Wolves is I'm going to say it's a masterpiece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think Let's
definitely.
Go is phenomenal. I think Let's Go is incredible, but Out Come the Wolves is one that, like, they turned down a record label deal, and Out Come the Wolves comes out. Suddenly, there's ska back on an album. It's not just Let's Go 2.0. And I have friends who threw away their Operation Ivy stuff because they thought it was a sellout album. And I thought it was so stupid to do that.
I wasn't quite that bad, but I definitely was not a fan of ska getting on the radio and MTV, because at that point I'd been into the music for 3-4 years, and so it just felt, I guess it was more like a personal thing, like this is my thing, my subculture, and now all these like kind of Johnny come latelys. I mean, that's kind of a teenage mindset that you have, are like jumping on the bandwagon and stuff. So I wasn't necessarily angry at the bands and calling them sellouts. I wasn't quite in that mindset. I think it was just more like, this is my thing, and no one, all the people I went to school with didn't care about it except for my little group of friends, and now like all of a sudden everyone cares about it. So
yeah, it was a different time, Geekscape, because now, and I've said this on some of the music episodes in the past, is like doing music videos into the 2000s and hearing from a label that suddenly they weren't going to do albums, they were going to do EPs or singles. They were watching the digital shift in the music industry, and it made more sense for them. Me, as somebody who loves albums and loves the traditional, like sitting down, reading the liner notes, really discovering an album on its own, the way it was designed by the band, that came out of the whole idea that if you joined a major label
Mhm.
you were a sellout. And I remember standing outside of a schlep rock show and people talking about Less Than Jake signing to Capitol,
Yeah.
and they were ticked.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
Less Than Jake made some great albums on Capitol. They made some
Sure.
great albums on all the majors when they were going to majors or dipping back, and the Pure Noise stuff now is fantastic. They have a new EP coming out I'm excited about, but hearing these bands like going for major labels, and obviously at that point I think we're starting to hear Goldfinger on the radio.
Mhm.
We're hearing Gwen Stefani's voice on the radio.
Yeah.
We're hearing Mighty Mighty Boss Tones in a Kevin Smith movie. Still
Yeah.
an indie movie, but we're starting to hear Mighty Mighty Boss Tones on the radio, and suddenly the stuff isn't ours anymore. And as a teenager who's like found this just a few years earlier, 2, 3, 4 years earlier as part of your identity,
Mhm.
we had to kind of start learning to let go of this stuff and share it. At what point did your mindset, and maybe it's because you knew people in these bands and the realities of them making a living, at what point did your mindset, and maybe it hasn't, start shifting into acceptance of ska becoming wider there in the late 90s?
I don't really remember. I don't remember what my mindset was. I remember being angry when I heard "Just a Girl" on the radio by No Doubt, because I was a big No Doubt fan for years before that, and that's the only one I remember feeling kind of like ticked about,
Hmm.
in terms of like the thing that was like I was really into that suddenly was on the radio, because that was one of the first ones. No Doubt, you know. So but now I could just think about, in retrospect, my perspective on retrospect is that like I have mixed feelings about the whole thing. I think, like, on one hand, like I don't really subscribe to the selling out thing, but I also see how the way ska kind of was, I mean, the way it became a mainstream genre, and and presented and digested by culture, did create some issues with like its legacy and how people have like interpreted the genre, which is like why my book is called In Defense of Ska, not just like I love ska, it's super rad, and don't you love ska too? Because there's this whole baggage that has come with ska, and I think part of that is that it was presented, it's not really the band's fault, it was presented as this sort of like lighthearted, you know,
There's
candy.
not depth to it,
No,
right? It's
yeah,
like,
like they really
yeah.
stripped the depth from the subculture and the scene, and you know, and a lot of the problem is that a lot of the people that got into it, a lot of these quote unquote Johnny come latelys that I was kind of complaining about earlier, most of them didn't do their homework, and no one gave them the homework to do. You know, they kind of came in, it was a big party. I'm gonna wear the hats. Okay, now it's not cool. I'm out. I'm moving on to the next thing. And then 10 years later, they go like, "Oh my god, I can't believe I was part of this geeky little stupid subculture."
They got
And they
into it
just,
because swing
yeah,
dancing was too hard for them to learn.
yeah, yeah. And so they look,
Like, it's adjacent maybe.
so they look back at it, and they still look. A lot of them still look back at it now in their 40s, and they all they think of it as like is this dumb nerdy subculture, and they don't have any other context for it, and they could just keep making jokes about it or keep kind of like poking fun at themselves or poking fun at that scene. It's like, okay, fine, I get it, and I understand that's what it was for you, but this thing, it was so much more to a lot of other people, and it has like deeper roots, and it has continued on after it died in the mainstream, and it has is branched out, and it's all over the world. It's all like we were talking about in East LA, very vibrant scene there. It
That
does
was a
not fit.
revelation. That was
It
like
does,
for me, it was like a cultural lightning rod. It was like it felt very personal to find that scene.
and
Like,
it's not
yeah.
like how it's presented as like the 90s ska joke, like, you know, when they're presenting the subculture. You go to that scene, it's musically, it's not like, it's not that different musically. I mean, they're taking the same influences, but culturally and in terms of what the subculture is to the people, it's totally different. And I think the story of ska is that there are a million stories, like people take and marry it with their culture and their subculture. So it's very flexible. So yes, some like Orange County kids that grew up in rich suburbs can sort of mutate it to fit their culture. And so can like kids in East LA. And so can like people in Japan or Mexico City. And so I think like all of those are valid. And that's why to me it's not about like propping one up and lowering another. It's about sort of just like accepting them all and as the kaleidoscope of the subculture of ska.
As the like, and again, Geekscape, we're talking ska goes back decades, and you'll learn that when you read In Defense of Ska. Like, it goes back, and we're talking, I think,
60s.
correct me if I'm wrong, about the fourth. We're talking kind of predominantly right now about the fourth wave.
I'm not sure. Waves get a little funky once you get after two-tone, to be honest.
Okay, and so we're talking about an iteration that came after the 60s Geekscape. This was 3 decades after, at least after the start of it, and it went through many iterations, and it was widespread in a lot of places. We haven't even talked about the British scene, and so by the time Aaron and I, who are similar ages, like, we just, we're into this stuff in the late 90s. It's very personal, and the record labels come in because Green Day, who I love, and Rancid, who I love, and they want to find the next thing. And this is like the last. I think that the ska explosion was like the last kind of vestige of movement towards when we started getting. And I don't mean to bemoan like kind of besmirch the ska stuff, but it was the last pop before the actual pop of the Backstreet Boys in Sync. Like, listening to how poppy that stuff is and how much it bounces, and it's fun to dance to, and it literally has dances and good looking guys, and they, as Forever Legends, were kind of using some of that dance move stuff when they started out, and they're good looking kids, and it feels like they swung at ska. They wanted to keep the swing dance thing of like 1996, 1 year or so, going, and it educated them into what we got with Mojo Records later. And it's telling that, like, Real Big Fish and those places they were on Mojo, the Britney Spears label, because they were all kind of sharing. I'm probably wrong, but like, they're all sharing this sort of pop mentality. But the destruction that a label like that, or like that, this commercialization does to, like you said, the 3 decades prior to it and the 2 decades since, it doesn't take defending. You're doing it, you're defending it, but it's like those 3, 4, 5 years that the Mojo, the Capitol, these labels came in and said, can we replicate this punk thing? Can we replicate this swing year? Can we get ourselves to Britney Spears, Backstreet Boys, in sync? That's like I'm throwing out a little bit of a
I think idea. Like it's called In Defense of Ska, and I say I'm a defender, but it's really just I feel like I'm really just an educator, because I don't feel like you said, the music doesn't need defending so much as it just, people need to know more about it.
Yeah.
And they need to understand better context for the music and the history and the ongoing subculture and the ongoing global presence of the music. But yeah, ska was like this interesting period, like the 90s, for anyone who wasn't like an active music fan or a teenager or whatever in the 90s. The 90s was like peak. I'm pulling this out of the subculture, and I'm making this a mainstream trend for like 2 years. Boom, 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 boom. Grunge was like, nobody called it grunge before it was called grunge, right? And
no, it was just like, that was just bands. I mean, the amount of bands that REM brought out, like Nirvana, brought nationally and turned it into that scene. But they're alternative and they're grunge. Yeah, they were trying to sell us stuff. Yeah.
Swing and happened around the same time as ska. Swing was actually much bigger than ska, which is really funny to think about in retrospect. I mean, those bands were going platinum.
And Tony Bennett came back.
Yeah. After ska, you got like new metal was kind of a thing for a while. I feel like then you had the rock revival, whatever they called, like the Strokes and that whole New York scene. That was kind of a thing. And then I feel like, you get like mid 2000s mainstream emo, like Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance. And then there's still more stuff that happens, but I feel like that's when you really start to see the deterioration of like the mainstream sort of like subculture relationship. Like things really started to change. Yeah, no defense for new metal. There is no
defense for new metal.
I have explicitly offended new metal on In Defense of Ska.
You know what? When they start like asking how magnets work and stuff like that, like I'm throwing, like, that's an Insane Clown Posse reference. Like they start doing that kind of stuff. It's like, come on, friends. Like, so we're gonna go ahead and blame you for Kid Rock.
But
Uh,
but things are a little different now in the mainstream. It's not really subcultures that came from the underground that have been propped up and sort of like stripped away from their essence in the mainstream now. It's just pop music has sort of shifted into a
it's because
different
labels
thing.
fell apart.
Labels are really strong right now. I think
Oh,
labels
you
are
think? Oh,
making.
they are. I don't know.
I've read many articles. They are making a killing off of streaming. Bands are not
Oh,
making a
okay,
killing. Labels are extremely strong right now.
but the bands themselves are not
Well,
because
some
they
are.
can't.
I mean,
Yeah.
it
Okay.
depends on the deal they have. I mean, not to get too in the weeds of streaming, but people talk about streaming like you get X amount of cents per stream. It's not really the case.
Okay.
You get what you get is based off of the deal you have and how many download and how many stream. So it completely depends. Taylor Swift is not suffering. She is not doing bad in terms of her streaming revenue because she's got a good deal. Let's just
Sure.
say that. Um, Anyways, that's a whole other topic, but
No, you're here to educate me. So I think this is awesome. I love this. We have Lisa Soares. She popped into the conversation and say, just popping in. I've not read the book, just learning about it. I'm from Rhode Island. Have you ever heard of the Agents out of Providence? Oh, I'm sure
I
Providence has an awesome indie scene.
I have
I've loved
not
them
heard of
since the
the
90s.
agents. I will
Yeah.
definitely check them out though.
Yeah. I love that we're learning all this stuff. I mean, Geekscape is, I felt like I was in such an island moving to Los Angeles and starting a film career, even after doing a aerobic fish video and stuff like that. I was like, okay, this is their fans, isn't it? So Geekscape really is my place where I can bring people like Aaron on and learn a bit from them.
So,
I love
so
that.
George,
Yeah,
oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead. No,
Well, I
no, I
was
was
going
gonna
to.
say I love that you threw out, and Geekscape is really like, if you're really into music of this era, you were going to go beyond the major labels like Mojo and Capitol, and you were going to start discovering this other stuff. And no better place than when Vinny Fiorello, who's a former guest at Geekscape and started Fueled by Ramen, when he and Mike Park, when it was starting Asian Man Records, like those guys were finding the real bands, and they weren't just ska bands, right? Like we have Alkaline Trio coming out of Asian Man Records, those first couple of albums, and but I remember I was in radio at the time, so I had a little bit of an indie college radio advantage. But having Slow Gherkin sleep on the radio station floor with, we just had like a full night after their concert, and they played our radio show, and we just hung out. But the bands like that, I feel like when you know bands like that, you realize that it's more than just this silly, frivolous popcorn cotton candy pop, right? Like that it's a culture.
It's not just a culture, but it's like, ska's roots go. I mean, it's not just. I feel like people who have like a very superficial understanding of ska, some of them know that like, okay, this is Jamaican music from the 60s, and then Two Tone revived it, and then it came to the US in the 90s. Like that's a better understanding than some people, but it's still superficial because ska came to the US right on the back of Two Tone in the early 80s. And there was a scene in the 80s and the early 90s of ska. So when ska started to get propped up in the mainstream via major labels, we're talking like 15, 16 years of this being an underground genre in the US. And there were moments where ska was like bubbling up, and maybe it felt like, if you talk to people from that era, they all felt
80s?
like the 80s, early 90s, they all felt like, oh, is now the time ska's going to blow up? Like that moment kept happening over and over and over again, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, who
Right.
are those bands? Like
Well, Fishbone is probably
Fishbone's the big one.
Yeah, so in the the Untouchables were like kind of the main. They weren't the very first LA band, but they were sort of the early main LA band. Great band. Like kind of like a mod ska thing. They got cool suits. They were always at the scooter rallies. Their shows had scooters like lined out the door. LA
Is that a
had
British thing? The scooter
yes.
thing? Because
Yeah,
you start seeing like
it's all like
quadrophenia and stuff like that.
yeah, exactly. It's sort of, I mean, all of it's kind of British. I mean, like Two Tone, like our understanding of ska in the 80s comes almost exclusively from Two Tone, not from Jamaica. So all the bands in the US in the 80s, they're emulating or they're taking influence from British ska, not from Jamaican ska. Some of them are like learning about Jamaican ska, but only because they fall in love with Two Tone first.
And those bands
Right.
were like the Madness or something
So
what am I
like, so
learning?
we're talking about specials. We're
The
talking about the
specials.
selector,
Yeah,
English
selector.
beat. Yeah. So,
The
and then,
English Beat
yeah,
had hit, like they all had hits on
yes,
radio in the 80s.
they were top 40 bands in the UK, but they were not big.
Really?
They were in the US, they were like modest. They had modest success.
They'd be in a
They,
movie, or maybe.
I mean, it was around, it just wasn't mainstream in the US. It wasn't like a big thing in the US. But it was huge in England, like
And
massive
like
in
you
England.
said several times, people thought that was going to be what popped. They were going to pop.
So there was a sense. I mean, Fishbone got signed to a major label in the mid '80s. The Untouchables got signed to a major label. The Toasters, who started in like '83, maybe. There's some debate about what year they officially started, because they were originally a band called Not Bob Marley, and they had some member changes. But early '80s. Let's just say early '80s.
Yeah.
Toasters started. They had like a few moments where they had sit downs with major labels, never quite got signed. There is a side tangent here. In the mid '90s, when ska was popping, they had a sit down with Mercury Records, who offered to acquire the entire label. And this was in my book. I didn't get the exact number. They didn't tell me, but apparently they were offered a terrible offer for the entire label, so they said no.
Mm.
But anyways, it was offered. It could have been Moon Records. The entire catalog could have been bought up by Mercury.
Sure.
So, anyways, so there was all of this sort of, there's all this opportunity and interest in ska, but there was no understanding of how to market it. I mean, if you watch the Fishbone documentary, Everyday Sunshine, they talk about that. They talk about being signed. They're not exclusively ska, but their early stuff is dominated by ska. And they have this sort of, like, they know it's a great band. They know these guys are interesting and unique, but it's like, okay, this is an all black band, but they're playing this kind of fast, weird music that they don't really understand. So who's the audience for this band? They're getting shuffled between the rock and the urban department, and neither feels like it's quite makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But like you
the
said,
band name Death had that similar problem in the 70s. The documentary, our band name.
Yeah.
Do you remember a band named
Yeah,
Death,
yeah.
and the black kids in Detroit who were a metal band? And I'm
Death
guessing
had the same problem, but
Yeah.
they didn't really last very long. Whereas Fishbone, they were touring with the Beastie Boys. I mean, they were out there. People were in love with Fishbone. I mean, they were on Soul Train. They were on MTV. They had moments. Early '90s, there was the biggest push, I feel like, with what's the song, Everyday Sunshine.
Sure.
Which is kind of a gospel punk song. That was, to me, that was the biggest push to push that band into the mainstream, and it fell short in terms of the numbers. And then the band couldn't really keep it together after that for a whole wide range of things. But what happened in '94, to what you mentioned earlier, is Green Day broke, and then Offspring and Rancid, and then this gave people in industry an understanding of how to market ska. Now, was it the correct way to market ska? It gave them a filter, and that filter was punk rock. They didn't have that filter before. And so the bands that kind of got into that, fit that better, pop punk oriented bands, great bands, not putting down the bands, but Real Big Fish, Save Ferris, Goldfinger, Mighty Mighty Boss Tones. I mean, these bands fit into that sort of mid '90s pop punk influence ska sort of thing. And that's what became the representation of ska in the '90s, when it was like a thing, right? I mean,
but it was a narrow representation.
It was a very, I mean, look at bands like the Slackers or Hepcat or some of these other bands that existed and were doing well at the time. They weren't really part of that. They represented other sounds of ska. And there was a whole lot there was hundreds of bands that were like around in that same era. And everyone had their own take on ska. It wasn't like this uniform thing. An ME330 sounded totally different than like Mighty Mighty Boss Tones. And
when you see them together. I remember seeing ME330 and the Impossibles open for Les and Jake at Villanova. I think this is 1997, 98. And all three of those bands sound very different.
They sound different.
Very different sounding bands.
They come from different worlds. They themselves are very different people who have kind of their own, different influences and sort of different like subcultures of themselves. So I think, the ska was always, in the US was always this sort of like mishmash of all these different people and cultures kind of like putting it together. So that just doesn't work in a major label setting. You can't just be like, this music and this subculture is a mishmash of all kinds of different people from all kinds of different worlds, from all kinds of different places.
Doesn't really fit the assembly line
Yeah.
mold that they're trying to replicate for efficiency. Yeah.
But it's the same thing like with grunge, like, grunge was like just like kids that were really into like Neil Young and like sludgy rock and roll, right? And so they're like, well, okay, so they're from Pacific Northwest, and so they're trying to create a brand out of it, and like some of it's based in fact, some of it's definitely an exaggeration and a narrowing of it, just so they can like market and sell it in a way. But these bands aren't like coming from that place. They're just sort of playing what's authentic to them and the influences they have. And of course they're friends, so of course they take influences from each other, and so you can see connections, but the label's job is to like brand it.
Sure. In George Pepe says, all right, I read the first edition. What are some of the editions in the second edition? This one that comes out October 29th, Geekscape. It's not October 30th, October 29th. We got a second edition, expanded edition. It's called the expanded edition of In Defense of Ska. What are some of the additions? Because you added a lot of page count to
it's
this.
A lot. So George, thank you for asking. I believe it's worth your money, and I say that as a person who felt inclined to expand it. I didn't want it to be like, oh, okay, I tacked on a few interviews at the end. Now please buy it. Like I really like put a ton of work into this. Like I spent the better part of a year and a half revamping this book. There's a new cover. The cover's different. Yeah. The layout is better. It's different. You can see the photos are cleaned up, and what do you call it? The justification of the words around it are much more professional.
This ain't no zine. This isn't some zine you just printed and put out there in 2021. Now you've got a little bit of backing because you had a lot of cred. Like this thing came out in places like Rolling Stone and stuff for acknowledging the book. I mean, that's kind of awesome.
Yeah, and so then I re-edited everything, and I added and I cleaned up stuff through the entire book. And sometimes I'll add like a sentence or a paragraph or a whole section, and most of it was for creating greater context or adding anecdotes or stories that kind of like emphasize my point. And then the very end, there's a whole new extra chapter at the end, which is kind of a really long chapter, and I call it the Lost Years. It's emphasizes everything that kind of, well, not everything. I'm giving you snapshots of what happened after ska left mainstream to kind of talk about. So there's this ongoing question and narrative about ska now is like, did ska die? Is ska coming back? And I feel like it's sort of like the wrong question, and it's sort of the wrong conversation to have. And it's hard to say, because once you get in that conversation, you're either saying ska is dead or ska didn't die. And it kind of doesn't make sense. Like ska did leave the mainstream. Ska didn't stop. Like those things are the only like facts you can make. So what I did was I just wanted to kind of have a more longer discussion about this time period and say like, this is different stuff that was happening. And, you can kind of take what you want from that and say, just kind of get a visual of this era. So we'll talk about I talk a lot about Bad Operations, origin story in New Orleans with Community Records and everything that went on with their old bands, which is a very fascinating story. I talk about
how was that affected by Katrina? That's post Katrina.
It was very much affected by Katrina, and it's very it actually sort of boosted their scene in a way, because like a lot of kids didn't have many options and were devastated and were dealing with this trauma. So they kind of would go to these ska shows, and at the Big Top largely, which was a place that allowed shows after Katrina, and it kind of created this space for them to go and be a community and deal, kind of dance their feelings out and stuff. So this is Fatter Than Albert and Samurai Deli and some of these bands. Some of the members that became Bad Operation came from these bands. So this is the scene. I talk about that. I talk about how Katrina like kind of affected the scene, and then they eventually created Community Records, and they created this thing called Block Party, which is like an all-day festival that they're still doing now. So this is a whole like, you know, like 2000s 2010 story. I talk about there's a in Brooklyn in the 2010s, late 2000s, there was a Brooklyn Rocksteady scene, which I talk about, which is sort of this trad revival that happened kind of hipster Brooklyn bars and stuff. Some good bands came out of that, like the Frighteners. I talk about the traditional, kind of the ongoing traditional LA scene that happened after the 90s. Blue Beat Lounge being kind of like its main place with Chris Murray, but there's a lot more stuff like that. I mean, there's Junior Francis and Eric Kohler have been doing shows still to this day as Ska Mania, where they'll bring in like Jamaican artists from, you know, from who from the original era, and then they'll pair them with like local groups like the Steady 45s, who were playing traditional ska grooves like in the most pure, authentic possible way, and they'll like put these shows on and stuff, and it's awesome because you're getting to hear like these old legends play with musicians that are so like studious towards what these records sounded like. They're replicating the sounds of these 1960s ska records, and then, you know, so that's been, you know, LA is kind of like we talk about the East LA scene, right? There's the East LA scene. The traditional ska scene is the best traditional ska scene in the US is in LA for reasons that I explained in the book. Sort of the ongoing people that have supported it and the bands that have been around. I talk a little bit about Christian ska, but mostly because I want to talk about Five Iron Frenzy.
Matt Kelly's favorite band. Happy birthday, Matt, again.
They returned in like 2011 or so, you know, and they put out a Kickstarter to make a new album. It broke records. It broke Kickstarter records. So I kind of talk about like, why was the return of this Christian ska band such a big deal in a time when ska was allegedly dead? And it's an interesting story of why it was such a big deal and why it continues to be a big deal. Why people who love Five Iron Frenzy love Five Iron Frenzy. Like, they have some diehard fans who live and die by that band, and you know, it makes sense too when you hear about it. So those are just some examples of what's in that final chapter. And there's like brand new things that I've dropped into the main chapters, you know.
So you got to reread it, George Pepe. You got to reread the whole thing.
You got to reread it because every chapter's got something either changed or added, you know. Like I interviewed Against All Authority. I dropped them in a few sections. I interviewed Nate Albert from Mighty Mighty Boss Tones. I dropped that in a few sections.
That's pretty cool. What's the name of the New Orleans band again?
So the current band is called Bad Operation.
That's the one. They covered They did an Impossibles cover. That's how I discovered them. Or they did some collaboration with Rory, or they did a shout out with Rory or something. That's how they
sampled Impossibles and put it at the beginning of one of their songs. Yeah.
And the Impossibles is one of, I mean, I didn't know that bands like in Austin, of course I knew about the Green Days and the bands that I loved and could see on 120 Minutes, but suddenly like being able to be friends with these bands like the Impossibles, Dynamite Boy, those are so important. That was so important to me back then. So hearing that 20 years later, you know, like Bad Operation is going to sample the Impossibles, I'm like, wow, what's this New Orleans thing? What is this New Orleans band doing? Wow, how do they know that this is so great? I loved it.
Are you familiar with the sort of garage rock, LA garage rock band called Fiddler?
Yes, I love, you know, a kid 20 years younger than me told me about Fiddler. They're awesome. They were just on your show.
Yeah, so Zach Carper, he shouted out Impossibles in our
Fiddler's
episode.
Awesome. And this is how this happens. I meet a kid, right?
Yeah.
Because I do Geekscape and I still speak with the kids. All right.
You speak.
All right. I still Skibbity Ohio, all that res. I still got my you know, I'm a Sigma. I'm not even going to get into Brawl Stars, the game that me and a bunch of high schoolers play, but I am actually president of a Brawl Stars clan. They made me their president, and they're called the Super Sigmas. So if you're playing Brawl Stars, want to join my Brawl Stars clan, I'm guessing you're under 20 years old. I actually find myself as president of a Brawl Stars clan, which is a Supercell game. And all those kids are Super Sigma, Riz, Aura, all that stuff. I guess they thought I had Max Aura because they made me be the president of their clan. I will meet these kids through geek stuff, right? Maybe it's a comic store, maybe it's a convention, and I'll be like, hey, I think you'd really like this band, The Impossibles, or I think you'd really like this lesser known band. If you're into ska, maybe you like Slow Gherkin. You know, oh, you like rock a little bit more, then you're gonna want some of these Less Than Jake spinoff type of things. And then they throw back Fiddler.
Yeah.
Fiddler's
great band. Yeah.
They're awesome.
They put out a song a couple of years ago, and I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but it sounds ska-ish. And so I asked Zach about it. I'm like, what's up with this song? And he said, oh yeah, I was trying to write an Impossibles song because I was really listening to the Impossibles a lot. I was
mind
like,
blown.
I know, exactly.
Mind blown that my hometown band that it's like that band. I don't know. I mean, I talk to Gabe regularly. I talk to Rory regularly, and I'm like, that band could have just kept going and going and going. And I remember I was directing a video for Bayside in 2003, and Anthony from Bayside was like, The Impossibles is Phil Barrowan's best band. The Impossibles is Phil Barrowan's best band. And then, of course, like a year or two later, you start to get the Fall Out Boys and stuff like that, and Phil Barrowan, like John Janik and that stuff became a huge success. We're very partial to the Punchline here at Geekscape because those boys made my theme song, and they collaborate with us the entire history of Geekscape. But yeah, that whole Fueled by Ramen thing, and I don't know if Animal Chin or Impossibles or the Hippos or whatever was the first band on. I want to say the Impossibles was the one Vinny signed first, but
I can't remember.
It just feels so personal to me. So anytime I hear an Impossibles thing, my head explodes.
I wrote extensively about that's something else that's in that final chapter. I wrote extensively about Fueled by Ramen and sort of their story and how they contributed to the ska that came out in the late 90s, and also how it shifted and went into sort of Fall Out Boy and that whole sound. So there's a whole
Starship.
Yeah, there was another band, one of the few ska bands that did not, that really kind of got forgotten. That was on Fueled by Ramen was called the Supertone. Wait, no, not Supertone. I can't remember. It's a New Orleans band, and my brain is forgetting. They were the band that sort of influenced the New Orleans kids, like Fatter Than Albert and all them. And I will remember, but I'm not remembering it now. But they were on Fueled by Ramen, and they really just did not like, the Impossibles, Animal Chin, these other bands, the Hippos, much more known than this band. Superflies. There we go.
Superflies. Okay.
Yeah, they were Fueled by Ramen ska band.
I just miss all of those like CDs that like the Rains would hand outside of shows. They would have these little mix CDs of all these different bands, and like Richard and Stephanie Rains would just be handing them outside of shows, even in Philly. Like I remember going to see a band, maybe it was Blink in Philly, and suddenly I'm getting a nice little Fueled by Ramen or Drive Through Records sampler.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what's this band, Mother Mania? Like there's all these like deep cut bands. But that's how you find out about River Phoenix, later Phoenix TX, or you find out about these bands and you get into that. And of course, nobody was better than that stuff than Mike Park. Who just started with like you said, the Skink and Pickle, early 90s, and just still carries that torch. And Mike, I love you so much, dude, and I want to keep collaborating with you. And I know it's been years since we talked, but I hope that my double clicks on Instagram on all of your posts, I hope that lets you know that I love you, still support you, and Geekscape's still here for you. That's what our support has turned into as we become busier adults. Is like, I hope you guys who are out there know that my double clicks, the little heart that shows up when you check your notifications on Instagram, that means I still love you, and all that. George Pepe says sold. Okay, he's buying the extended edition. Cool.
So your shirt, the Stereo, who were on Fueled by Ramen. I talk about this a little bit in the book because the Stereo comes out in like 99, I think, their first record.
Yeah,
and it's a product of the Impossibles and Animal Chin, right?
The
It
left and
doesn't.
right of the stereo is how I got this name. Like Rory and Jamie, who I'll tell you, Jamie's wife I've never talked to, but she found me on LinkedIn somehow, and Jamie knows this. There's nothing crazy going on, but she wanted baby pictures from our baby. And so I talked to Jamie mostly through Jamie's wife and sending baby pictures that she shares with Jamie. Even though Jamie and I follow each other on social media, and I could just send him a DM. His wife is getting the baby photos to send to Jamie, and that's just who we've become as adults. Because they played my radio show in '99 as well, and God, I love 300. I love that new one. This new one is
the new one's great. But 300
is awesome.
300 is considered kind of like secretly influential in a lot of like what kind of rock and pop punk and emo.
Talk to the Fall Out Boy. Talk to your boy Patrick Stump about that one.
Patrick Stump and other bands too. Other bands from that sort of scene, like they shout out the Stereo's 300. So that is discussed a little bit in the book, is how this Stereo kind of like had an influence on 2000s punk and rock.
Did you see what Patrick Stump did on that last Fall Out Boy tour? So he went to all these different, Fall Out Boy's playing every major city, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they stopped in Pittsburgh, he took the piano out and did a Punchline cover.
Oh yeah.
When he went to Minneapolis, I think he did an Animal Chin cover or a Stereo cover. This dude Patrick Stump has been coming out to all these different. He'll do a cover. I'm not saying he did it the whole time, Patrick, but I've seen video of him going to these cities and being like, "Hey, this is a band that's from here, and I'm going to cover one of their songs." And I think it's so effing awesome. And what a testament to what a cool dude that guy is.
So Patrick was on In Defense of Ska in 2021. Huge ska fan. He has a second appearance on In Defense of Ska, and
the extended edition or the podcast, which people should also
the podcast. He's also in the book. There's a whole long section about Patrick Stump's ska story in Defense of Ska second edition. But he's going to be on our podcast again on the 23rd. So just like a couple weeks. And he goes deep. He goes deep.
Of November or October?
October. It's coming.
Oh, he's on like next week.
Yeah, so
it's why you should be subscribing, Geekscape.
Yeah, you can listen to the episode. I mean, we talk about Blue Meanies for like the first 10 minutes. He loves that band. We talk about Fishbone. He knows all the like nitty gritty of every 90s ska band. Like he was so into that stuff, and he still loves it. You'll see him wear ska shirts occasionally on tour these days. He told me recently that he's been like adding pins to his jacket.
That's so cool.
Ska pins. Like it was a very fundamental part of his personality and his identity that he kind of talked about. Like he kind of came up at that age where ska became uncool, and so he kind of felt like I don't want to be made fun of, so I'm going to kind of like downplay my interest in ska. But now he's like, he did our show and twice now, and he's like kind of embracing it a lot more now.
Tell him hi. I've never talked to him.
All right. Best way to purchase In Defense of Ska.
Yeah, let's talk about this. George Pepe, let me throw it up on the thing. He says, "What is the best way to purchase your new edition?" I know how I'm going to do it. I'm going to come to your event November 4th here in Los Angeles.
That's a good way to do it.
I want a damn signature on mine.
If you're going to get it online, yeah. If you want it, I have some more events. I'll announce those. But if there's not an event in your city and you can't come, if you want to go online, you can go to bookshop.org. That's a good place to get it. If you want to get it on Amazon, no judgment. I understand Amazon's easy, but bookshop.org is a good place to get it if you feel weird about buying from Amazon. You can also just go to your local bookstore that you love and just say, like, do you have this book? If they don't have it, you can order it and they'll get it for you. And then that also kind of signals to them that people are interested in this book and they might order more copies. And if you don't want to spend any money, you can go to the local library, see if they have it. If they don't have it, request it, and then they'll order it. And then that also signals to the library and the library network, like, people are interested in this book. So any of those ways you choose to get it that feels best to you is awesome to me, because it benefits me in different ways. And, selling books is kind of a tricky thing these days. So however you do it, and post about it. If you want it, if you love it, post about it and be like, I love this book. And then, it helps us indie authors if people do that kind of stuff.
Well, Aaron, congrats on the book, dude.
Thank you.
You guys have your you guys have your own website for it as well, though, right? If they want to go to
just my, I mean, Aaron-Carnes.com. I have a website. It's not.
Okay.
I'm missing stuff, but there is a link to the book.
That's all we want is them to be able to get to it.
Let me give some dates. So
Okay.
yes, I'm going to be Sacramento, where I live. It's going to be the first one. It'll be on October 24th, which is a few days before the book releases, but you can get the book there. October 24th at Time Tested Books. I'll be there. Please come if you live in this area. On November 3rd, I'll be at Fall Brewing in San Diego. And then November 4th, I'll be at Vroman's Book in Pasadena, and where I'll be hanging out with my friend Jonathan.
Yep.
November 15th. Yes, November 15th, I'll be at Third Place Books in Seattle. I have a Portland date that's kind of coming together, but I just look for Portland. It's going to be the day before or the day after that Seattle date. I'm working out the details right now. November 21st, I'll be at Green Apple Books in San Francisco. December 5th, I'll be at Barnes & Noble in Philadelphia.
That's my birthday. You should celebrate that by going.
We'll celebrate it. December 6th.
Well, Matt Kelly, you should go there. You should go to the December
Matt Kelly.
5th one. Be there.
December 6th, I'll be at Broken Goblet, which is near Philadelphia. I don't remember exactly its address, but it's in the same area. And I think it's going to be a Hub City Stompers show. And then me and Mark Wasserman, who wrote the book Ska Boom and recently wrote this book called Soul Salvation about English Beat's third record. We're going to have a conversation and kind of like a shared book experience. And then I am working on a few more East Coast dates that have not been finalized. And then also I'm going to do one in New Orleans, probably the second week, probably like the 14th or 15th of December. That's being ironed out. But this one's going to be a very special event because it's not going to be a typical book event, because so much of the second edition is about all the stuff I said about New Orleans, about Bad Operation, about Katrina, about Community Records, this whole story. Me and those guys, a panel of like 5 people, we're going to like sort of tell this story live. And it's just going to be really fun and really interesting. It's not going to be specifically about my book, but it's going to be about telling this special New Orleans story with the people that were there. I'll probably record it. Maybe I'll even release it as an episode in 2025. We shall see. But if you live in New Orleans or in the South, I think it would be a ton of fun to come out to it, because it's not going to be a typical event, and it's going to be a once in a lifetime sort of experience. And it's not something that's ever happened or will happen again. I mean, it's just going to be a very unique experience.
And I think that whole story right there would make the greatest, like a really great oral history book as well. That whole situation that happened, like you said, starting with the Superfly, Katrina, and then this scene kind of fighting for its survival and kind of growing back and turning into something that today is awesome.
But because ska, like, I just will say this before we go.
No, please.
The story of ska over and over and over again, regardless of what part of the country or what culture you are in, I feel like the story of ska continues to be in some shape or form about community, because it's largely not something that makes a ton of money. I mean, there's been a few people that have made a lot of money on ska, not a lot of people, but the people that do it, the people that participate in it, do it because they love it, and they do it because it's something, they get something from community out of it. And people support each other, people help each other. And I feel like that story comes up over and over again in my book. You really see that in the New Orleans chapter, which we'll get into at that event. But you see it in all kinds of other forms. You see it in like East LA. You see it in like, how this music has like developed a whole thing in Mexico City. You see it's community. And I think it's a beautiful thing. So,
well, Aaron, November 4th.
November 4th.
In Pasadena, kind of a big date for our country.
It is. It is the day before the election.
Holy crap! I remember. Let's hope we're celebrating by the end of that week. Oh my god!
It's funny.
I'm usually at a show or a book signing. I was filming a movie in Brazil in 2016. So I won't leave the country, Geekscape, so I won't do that to you. But I remember in 2008 being at the Troubadour at a what's Jack Antonoff's band from Drive Thru?
Yeah, what were they called? I can't remember.
I love that band, and they're playing, and that's what I remember from the 2008 Obama victory was being there and kind of talking to Jack and those folks and being like, dude, this is awesome. This is awesome.
Yeah.
You know, so hopefully we're feeling that way on Monday, the 4th of November.
Well, Monday the 4th is, we'll see,
I won't have fingernails after that.
Well, what's funny is like, I'll be down there for the 3rd for San Diego and the 4th for that event, but I'm also going to be down there all week because I'm recording my audiobook for In Defense of Ska. And that was the dates that they had. So I'm going to, like, Tuesday, the election day, Wednesday, the day after, I'm going to be in the studio all day, like all week. And
you can hear your voice change during the
yeah.
You'll be able to hear your voice be happy or happier, hopefully. And,
I mean, on one hand, it's going to be a distraction for me, but the other thing is, I hope I can focus on my book, with everything that's happening in the world. So,
okay, we're gonna look out for each other on that.
Yeah.
Okay, you need a shoulder to cry on. You're here in Los Angeles, and I'll make myself available. And Geekscape is, over the last 18 years, I made myself available to you guys right here on this podcast. I hope you guys learned a lot. I know I have. I'm sorry for having to speak on some of these because people like Aaron and some of my guests are so interesting. And I learned a ton, and it's incredible. The book, the extended edition of In Defense of Ska, is out on October 29th. So the best place to learn more about it, aaron-carnes.com, will lead you to the right places. But you said bookshop.com, is that correct?
Bookshop.org is a good, like,
bookshop.org.
If you want to buy it online and you want to, like, you want to not give your money to Amazon, bookshop.org is a good place. They also donate a little bit of every sale to independent bookstores. So it's a way to support independent bookstores, but also, a way to support independent bookstores is to go to independent bookstores, buy it or order it. There's all kinds of ways. I understand the convenience of Amazon, and if that's how you want to do it, that's fine. But there are alternatives to Amazon as well.
Well, Geekscape is you got plenty of options too for downloading this podcast. Maybe it's Spotify, maybe it's Apple Podcasts, whatever it is. Leave us a 5-star review if you enjoy our conversation. Share it with your friends. That really helps out a ton. And we have other shows on the Geekscape network ranging in all sorts of pop culture interests, from pro wrestling to horror movies to more music podcasts and filmmaking and all of that. So please explore the Geekscape. We do this for you for free, 99, and have been for years and years and years. So find us on social media. Come hang out with us, because next week we're probably not going to be talking about ska. I know I have a music episode coming up soon, but maybe we get back to comics. Maybe we get back to movies or something. The new Penguin show. I love the Penguin show. I'm enjoying the Agatha all along. I know you guys are going to make me see Venom 3. You guys got lots of stuff coming here. So there'll be more Geekscape. The best way to do is just subscribe. You'll see what I got coming. All right. If it's pop culture, I want to talk to people about it. So I'll see you guys on the next one. Thank you so much, Aaron.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.